My name is Katrina Salazar, and I would like to call to order the California Board of Accountancy's consideration of the CPA Experience Requirements Task Force meeting. It is September 15th today, and I would also just point out that this committee is also referred to as Cert. So welcome everyone that is here at the Board of Accountancy, as well as following us on WebEx Online. The Board of Accountancy has provided the opportunity for the public to participate via the WebEx platform that I mentioned. When we take public comments during our task force meeting, we will begin by taking public comments from those individuals attending in the California Board of Accountancy headquarters meeting location, and I will then ask the moderator to open up the lines for public comment online. You will be allotted up to 5 minutes each for public comments. And with that sets some of our ground rules for how we will handle the meeting. And I would like to pause and turn the meeting over to Ms. O'Connor so that we can take roll.
Katrina Salazar.
Present, and I did omit, when you turn on your mics, please pull them towards you, as that is how everyone will be able to hear you throughout the recordings. Thank you.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines.
Good morning or afternoon here.
Nancy Corrigan.
Present.
Dan Buston.
Present.
Liz Molina Lopez.
Present.
David Sentini.
Present.
Rich Samidian.
Present.
Michael Williams.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And we do, as you just heard, we do have a quorum. Some of our items of business before I talk about the mission is I would like to comment that we do have a new member here. So I'd like to just pause a moment now that we've officially convened to welcome Michael Williams, CPA, to our task force. Mr. Williams presently serves as the chair of our qualifications committee, and he was appointed on an interim basis to the Cert committee by President Savoy to fill the vacancy that was left by Mr. Kabatek. So an item will be taken to the Board of Accountancy at its meeting next week to formally modify the composition of the Cert task force to allow the CBA to make this appointment permanent. And so I would like to go on record and thank Mr. Kabatek for his contributions and the service to the Cert committee, and also welcome Mr. Williams. So thank you. Would you like to say a few words, Mr. Williams?
Just thank you, and I'm appreciative to be part of the committee.
Fantastic. All right. I would like at this point to remind our committee members as well as the public that the mission of the Board of Accountancy is to protect consumers that by ensuring only qualified licensees practice public accountancy in accordance with established professional standards. This mission is derived from the statutory requirement that protection of the public shall be the highest priority for the California Board of Accountancy in exercising its licensing, regulatory, and disciplinary functions. Whenever the protection of the public is inconsistent with other interests sought to be promoted, the protection of the public shall be deemed paramount. So with that, we have reiterated our mission. I think it's especially applicable to our discussion that we are having today. And I would like to move on to agenda item number 1, which is public comments for items that are not on the agenda. So with that, I would like to ask if there is any public comment here at headquarters. Okay. Seeing no public comments, I'd like to open it up for public comment through the moderator.
Thank you. This is the moderator. My name is Ann Fisher. If you would like to make a comment on an item that is not on the agenda, you may look for the Q&A feature of WebEx, which we have enabled to facilitate public comment You can look for the question mark icon, typically in the lower right corner of your computer screen. Or if you are a calling user, you may press *3 to raise your hand. Each commenter will be recognized in the order received and will be given 5 minutes to speak. The other option for WebEx participants is to click the hand icon, which you should see next to your name in the participant list. And I do not see any requests for public comment. Shall I close that feature?
Yes, moderator, please close the panel. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So with that, that concludes item number 1, public comments for items not on the agenda. And we move along to item number 2, which is approving minutes of the May 19th, 2022 Cert meeting. So I would like to take comments from Ms. Farrell Hines.
I'd like to move to approve the minutes from the May 19th meeting.
Okay, so we have a first. Do we have a second?
Yes, I'd like to second that motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Corrigan. So we have a second from Ms. Corrigan. We do have a motion on the table. Are there any discussion or comments from our committee members, or I'm sorry, our task force members? Okay. Seeing none, I would like to go ahead and call for the vote and turn it over to Ms. O'Connor. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. I did skip the public comment. So I would like to open it up in the room for any public comments on the motion on the floor, which is to accept the minutes. And seeing no public comment here in the room, I would like to ask the moderator to please open up public comment online.
Thank you. This is the moderator, and we've opened up the Q&A feature of WebEx to facilitate public comment. If you'd like to make a comment on the minutes, you may type the word comment into the Q&A text box and click send. The other option is to raise your hand, either by clicking on the hand icon on your WebEx screen, or for calling users, pressing *3 will raise your hand. And I do not see any requests for comment. Shall I close that Q&A?
Yes, moderator, please close the Q&A.
Thank you.
And now that we've handled the public comment section, now I would appropriately like to turn it over to Ms. O'Connor.
Katrina Salazar,
Yes.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines,
Yes.
Nancy Corrigan,
Yes.
Dan Beston,
Yes.
Luz Molina Lopez,
Yes.
David Sentini,
Yes.
Rich Simidian,
Yes.
Michael Williams,
Abstain, as I was not at that meeting.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Okay, thank you. With that, we move along to item 3, which is information regarding the purpose and goal and consideration of the Cert materials for this meeting. So what this does, this document, it creates a framework for the materials that are being provided here. I won't go through and read the whole memo since it is, of course, available, but I will give a brief summary. So at the March 2022 meeting, our Cert members discussed various topics, and we raised a lot of questions about Attest and general experience requirement as it relates to both our state as well as nationally. A few of these topics that we highlighted were the application review process, peer review, disciplinary information, as well as the Attest experience requirements in other states. At the next meeting in May, Cert continued these discussions and identified more questions. Additional information was requested pertaining to feedback from advisory committees regarding the Attest experience requirements, enforcement statistics about how our board compares to other states in terms of length of time for discipline to be imposed, information about how the American Institute of the Certified Public Accounting Professional Codes of Conduct is being captured within Board of Accountancy statutes and regulations. And then we requested follow-up with other state boards that didn't initially respond to our survey request regarding possible changes to their experience requirements. Of importance, when we started this process in March, the primary question established to guide this group is the question of, is the present Attest experience requirement necessary and sufficient to support the California Board of Accountancy mission to protect consumers by ensuring that only qualified licensees practice public accountancy in accordance with professional standards? We talked about this question as having two parts, the first being necessity and the second sufficiency. And it's worth repeating that the necessity focuses on the applicants needing to have authority to sign reports on Attest engagement. So we're being fairly targeted here. And necessity was a primary focus of our discussions, and whether or not Cert will recommend to continue the Attest experience requirement. So all of the materials that were prepared for the May meeting and now for September are really intended to focus us in on this first question of necessity. So today, our task force will have the opportunity to determine if we are in a position to make a recommendation on the necessity of the Attest experience requirement. And that will happen after considering the presentations, the materials, our discussion, and that will be when we get to, that discussion will actually happen specific to the question in agenda item number 12. So it is worth pointing out that any recommendation that our committee makes here, the Cert committee, will then go to the full Board of Accountancy for its consideration. Depending on the discussion and the action taken at the Board of Accountancy, it may require the board to seek a legislative change, which would necessitate the board seek an author to carry a bill to effectuate any change. So we are part of a process, and just it's worth reminding everyone of what our role is. And so at this time, I would like to open the meeting up to comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. We will do the same thing. We will take public comments here from our Cert members as well. First, then we'll go to public comment. So any questions on this agenda item or discussion from our Cert members? Okay. So seeing and hearing none, I would like to open it up for public comment here in the room at headquarters. And seeing no comments here, I would like to ask our moderator online if you could please open it up for public comment on Cert item number 3.
This is the moderator, and we've opened up the Q&A feature of WebEx to facilitate public comment. We do have one request for comment from someone logged into WebEx as Juventino Gaitan. And Juventino, I'm going to send you a request to unmute your microphone so that you will have your 5 minutes to speak. And Juventino, did you receive a pop-up on your screen saying unmute me? If you did, you can click on that. And there is content in the Q&A text box, which I can read if the committee chooses to do that.
Moderator, am I correct that we're not getting audio from our?
Correct.
Okay. Yes, could you please read the written comment in lieu of the person providing auditory feedback?
Certainly. The comment is, my name is Juventino Gaitan. I'm currently working as an accounting for the federal government in California and am also a CPA exam candidate. How do I gain experience if none of my agency colleagues currently hold California CPA licensure? And Mr. Gaitan says he does not have voice capability with his computer. and there are no further requests for public comment at this time.
All right, thank you. I appreciate those comments, and that comment has been heard and noted. It doesn't specifically relate to this particular agenda item, so members are not allowed to respond or to act on that comment, but we have certainly made note of that at the staff level, and I appreciate the public comment being submitted. And moderator, could you please close the public comment feature since there are no more comments?
Certainly, it is closed.
All right, thank you so much. So with that, our next agenda item, or next two agenda items, in fact, are written reports only, agenda items 4 and 5. So I will just take a moment to read what they are out loud, the titles, so that people can follow along. 4 is additional information regarding whether other states intend to make modifications to their existing experience requirements for CPA licensure. And 5 is information regarding the AICPA's report on enhancing audit quality. It's the 2021 highlights and progress summary. So those are in the materials and are written reports only. So I am allowed, even though they're written reports, simply to inquire, do our task force members have any comments or discussion items regarding those written reports? Mr. Powell-Hines?
Yes, so I wondered in the report, it talked about the jurisdictions that responded to the survey about their Attest experience. And it stated that there were 26 jurisdictions that responded to the poll. So that was only about half of the jurisdictions. I just wanted to make sure that I was reading that correctly, and also to just ask staff whether they felt like the number of comments, responses that were received were adequate to help to provide enough material and information to, sort of draw some, not necessarily conclusions, but to draw, whether it be reasonable to draw some of the interpretations that we might have about the information that was presented.
And before we respond, your comment relates to item number 4 as well. And so since it was
just at number 4, right? Only number 4.
Apologies. Yeah. Do we have a response from staff since it was directed towards staff?
Sure. As it relates to drawing information or conclusions from the survey, that's really up to the task force whether or not it's meeting your needs. But at the last meeting, I believe there was 22 responses, and the board had asked, or this Cert had asked for us to go back up to some specific states to make sure that even though we weren't getting the full volume of the 55 jurisdictions, we would potentially get the bigger ones like Texas, Florida, New York, and I believe Illinois or Ohio was one of those states. So that's how that survey expanded a little bit. So again, the conclusions are that for Cert, but staff have followed up and gotten those larger states as requested.
Additional comments from our committee members? I guess the reaction I have to that, I think it's a fantastic question. It was circulated, and to me, a lack of response. It's hard to infer what we don't get, but if it was a pressing issue, I would have thought that we would have received a higher response rate. So to me, I read between the lines, which may or may not be appropriate, and say the states that didn't reply clearly didn't see this as a burning topic that they felt they must weigh in with us. So directionally, it felt guess I'm wanting to make a conclusion. I probably shouldn't, but I do feel confident that they were given an opportunity to respond. So that I do, I feel like the lack of response does not mean that they were not given the chance to share their concerns if they had them. So, all right.
I have another.
Please.
I also thought it was notable if we were looking at some of the responses. I think that's on page 16 of the entire packet, but it's the page 2 of item number 4. It was interesting to me some of the responses that the jurisdictions gave. Particularly, there was one jurisdiction that has a minimum of 1,000 hours of Attest experience. And then there was, there were several other jurisdictions that did not distinguish between and differentiate in the licensing, sort of that presumption that, if you are licensed, then your expectation of your professional judgment, sort of is guiding. And I did think it was also notable that second to last bullet point, that there was a large jurisdiction that does not distinguish Attest experience from other work experience, specifically just noting it and only requiring a year of work experience as being sufficient to, perform those kinds of specialized services. So I did draw some conclusions from it. I thought it was really helpful and informative. And my reason for asking staff was just, from their professional opinion, whether they had any additional perspectives. But it was really helpful to get the survey, and I appreciated not only that staff prepared it and sent it out, but also the follow-up that was conducted and the summary that was provided about it. It was really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Mr. Smithian?
Thank you, and I appreciate the follow-up with some of the larger jurisdictions as well. I thought that was, I think, helpful to understand. At least we're attempting to reach some of the larger jurisdictions with, 10,000 or more members. But one of the bullet points in that report discusses, it's the second bullet point following the table 1. It talks about a jurisdiction and responding that they do require 2 years of experience. However, the last sentence refers to that experience being evaluated during firm licensure rather than individual licensure. And I wanted to get maybe some context or at least some insight to the extent where what that looks like. What does that mean that it's not being done? Because a lot of our discussion goes to the process an individual goes through to obtain the A license. So how would that look if it was at a firm licensure level?
I can just be honest, I have no idea because we just took the responses from those firms. And right now I don't have in front of me who that particular firm or state is. So it would require us to kind of delve into that a bit more, that information. So I can't speak to beyond what they've articulated to us, and we just cut and paste and put into the responses.
Okay.
Mr. Dustin?
Thank you, Chair Salazar. I would just, I don't know the specific jurisdiction, but I know there are some jurisdictions that have considered requiring as part of firm registration that the individuals who have that experience be identified on the registration requirement, so that essentially somebody who's signing the attestation on behalf of the firm is attesting or assuring that people signing those reports have the necessary requirement or necessary experience.
Okay.
I think that's a great question and discussion, because when I hear this, being highlighted, I'm hearing, again, what Mr. Dustin mentioned, that some states are dealing with some of these issues at the firm level, and we're specifically focused on the individual level, but it does go to show that it can be approached in multiple ways. So I think that is important to consider.
That raises another interesting point to consider, because where the way that California handles it is that we make it the responsibility of the licensee to ensure that they are appropriately qualified to provide this specialized experience. By having a firm be responsible for that, it takes the responsibility off of the licensee, and it requires then the firm to be the, certification that individuals that when attestation is performed, it's the firm that is really putting their name and their, stamp on it, not just the individual who is performing the services. And that means that then the firm has a bit more skin in the game to make sure that anyone who's performing those services is really qualified. I think it's an interesting way for if we were going to consider modifying it. I know that's much farther down the line, but I would kind of parking lot that if we were going to consider whether to modify it, whether a way to modify it might be to, look at whether it would be through the context of firms, that are providing attestation services being the, I don't want to say, that they're attesting because that's too complicated a word, but make it a little more confusing. But they're really saying definitively like, yes, this is, accurate. This is, meets professional standards, and we take responsibility for if there is anything, problematic or anything that happens. It feels almost like another layer of protection for those who are seeking those services.
So, with that, we don't have counsel here. I hear what you're saying. I think we're starting to move into discussion that might be more relevant to 12. So I would like to pull us back. I don't want to dampen or stifle that idea, but I love the parking lot notion and keep it on the additional information in this written report. And then we're going to come back to these really great things in 12. Ms. Corrigan.
Can I just make one point of clarification, though, and in relation to this discussion? When the applications are submitted, it is a qualified individual, most likely with a firm, that is signing under penalty of perjury that the person has appropriately met that experience requirement. So it isn't just me in submitting my application say, yeah, guys, I've done it, I meet the requirement. Somebody else is attesting to the fact that I did and that my work has been supervised, et cetera. So thank you.
And there are some survey questions that sort of speak to that process, and that might be a point to highlight when we get to that report as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate the discussion here. I do need to open it up for public comment at headquarters here at the Board of Accountancy. And seeing no public comment, I would like to ask our moderator to open up the panel for public comment online. And we are requesting comment regarding Cert items 4 and 5.
This is the moderator, and if any of the online participants would like to make a comment on items 4 or 5, you may look for the question mark icon, typically in the lower right of your video screen, or you can hit *3 if you are a call-in user to raise your hand. You may also raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon next to your name on the computer. And I do not see any requests for public comment. Shall I close that feature?
Yes, moderator, please close the public comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so that moves us into item number 6. So I would like to welcome Mr. Dominic Franzella to make the next presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members. So the purpose of agenda item 6, which is the information regarding the California Board of Accountancy Enforcement Division processing times, is to provide this information to the Cert at its request. So at its March meeting, Cert inquired about how other states addressed enforcements and safeguards associated with not having an attest experience requirement. So to assist the Cert in understanding other states' enforcement practices, staff provided information on work the CBA undertook regarding substantial equivalency with respect to other states' enforcement programs that was brought about by the passage of some mobility legislation in 2012. Staff focused the presentation on the CBA's evaluation of these other states' enforcement practices in comparison to NASBA's guiding principles of enforcement. And during discussions on the topic, Cert inquired about how other states' enforcement processing timeframes compared to the CBA's enforcement division timeframes. So just as a bit of reference, the study that the CBA undertook to perform its analysis of the other states' enforcement practices was a multi-year effort that also required coordination with a lot of coordination with NASBA in order to complete that work. And as the CBA deemed other states to have enforcement programs that operated equivalent to NASBA's guiding principles of enforcement, and to have found those principles equivalent to CBA's own enforcement program, staff have provided a comparison of the CBA enforcement program performance measures to that of the NASBA's guiding principles of enforcement. So for reference, the CBA uses the Department of Consumer Affairs developed Consumer Protection Enforcement Initiative performance measures for its own program and has done so since DCA established those measures in and around 2010. And so attachment 2 to your materials, staff have included a table that illustrates how DCA performance measures compared to the NASBA guiding principles of enforcement and how the CBA's performance measures actually looked for the full fiscal year of 2021-2022. So at this time, this concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Chair Salazar, and I'm happy to do my best to answer any members' questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Franzella. Do I have discussion, questions, or comments from our task force members? Okay. So seeing none, thank you, Mr. Franzella, for that summary. I would like to go ahead and open it up for public comment here at headquarters. And seeing no public comment here, I'd like to ask our moderator to please open for public comment online.
This is the moderator, and the Q&A feature of WebEx has been enabled to allow for public comment. You may look for the question mark icon and then type the word comment into the text box and click send. The other option is to raise your hand, either by clicking on the hand icon next to your name or in the bottom row on your computer screen. Or for calling users, you may push *3 to raise your hand. Each person will be given 5 minutes to speak. And I do not see any requests for public comment. Shall I close the Q&A feature?
Thank you, moderator. Please close the Q&A.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. That concludes item number 6. And moving along to item number 7, I'd like to welcome Ms. Sarah Benedict, the licensing manager for the Board of Accountancy. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Benedict, and I'm the manager of the License Renewal and Continuing Competency Unit. The purpose of this agenda item is to provide the Cert with information regarding the CBA's Continuing Education, or CE, requirements for CPAs renewing their license in an active status. To renew a CPA license in an active status, a licensee must complete 80 hours of CE in the 2 years immediately preceding their license expiration. Those 80 hours include a minimum of 20 hours in each year of the 2-year license renewal period, and at least 12 of those 20 hours needs to be in a technical subject matter. It also includes 4 hours of ethics. Licensees must complete a 2-hour board-approved regulatory review course every 6 years. Licensees may be subject to complete specific technical subjects depending on the type of work they performed in the 2-year period immediately preceding license expiration. Licensees who performed work on government audits must take 24 hours of CE that focuses on governmental accounting, auditing, or related subjects. Licensees who perform work on audits, reviews, compilations, or other attestation services must take 24 hours of continuing education specifically related to accounting and auditing. And licensees who perform work on preparation engagements must take 8 hours of continuing education related to preparation engagement. Licensees who are subject to any of these specific CE requirements must also complete 4 hours of financial fraud CE. It is important to note that CE requirements are based on the work that the licensee performed and are not associated with the work they intend to perform or with the authority to sign attest engagements. That concludes my presentation. I will turn it over to Chair Salazar, and I'm happy to answer any questions that members may have.
Thank you. I'd like to ask if we have any member, task force member comments or discussion. All right, Mr. Smitty.
Thank you for the report. Just so I'm clear, are the requirements that are laid out in your report the same regardless of the type of license, whether it's an A or the G license?
That is correct. They're the same whether you have an A or a G license.
But if somebody has a G license, can I continue? If somebody has a G license, then some of the elements of their continuing education requirements, for example, the 24 hours of, where was it? Of CE specifically related to accounting and auditing. In that case, it just wouldn't be relevant to that G licensee.
In some cases, it may not, but I believe the law is pretty clear on if you're engaged in planning, directing, or performing substantial portions of the work. So there may be chances where someone with a G license may be involved with the attestation engagement, even though they're not doing like the main portion of it or signing on the engagement. Does that make sense?
It does. So we could have, notice we could have G licensees participating at some level in attest engagements, and therefore would still be subject to these requirements, despite the fact that they did not have the 500 hours of experience leading up to that, and that initial license.
And some additional clarification from Mr. Franzella.
Ms. Benedict is correct, and that is thinking about somebody who might be a G licensee now and who's also earning that experience to get an A license. They are participating in almost all aspects other than signing, so they would be subject to the A&A requirement or governmental auditing requirement at the time of renewal. Again, the CE is not, as Ms. Benedict said, license experience specific. Another misconception that individuals often have is they have an A license and they're having to always do the 24 hours and 4 hours of fraud in order to keep their A license. Once you have your A license, it's work dependent. So if you perform substantial portions on any part of those engagements, then you're going to be subject to the A&A requirement.
That was a great clarification. Any other comments or questions? Okay, at this point, I'd like to open it up for public comment here at headquarters at the Board of Accountancy. And seeing no public comment here, I would like to ask our moderator to open for public comment online, please.
This is the moderator, and we've opened up the WebEx Q&A feature for public comment. If you'd like to make a comment on this item, you can look for the question mark icon, typically in the lower right of your computer screen, and then type the word comment in the text box and click send. Another option is to raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon, and call-in users may raise their hand by pushing *3. And I do not see any requests for public comment. Shall I close the Q&A feature?
Yes, moderator, please close the Q&A feature. Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Benedict, for the presentation and the responses as well. So with that, that concludes item number 7, and we move to item number 8, which is discussion and overview of California's requirements associated with the accounting profession's requirements to adhere to professional standards. So with that mouthful, I will turn it over to Mr. Franzella.
Thank you, Chair Salazar. So at Cert's last meeting, there was a request for information on how professional standards, including the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct, are incorporated into California's Code of Regulations. As noted in the materials, the CBA maintains a regulation, specifically Regulation Section 58, that requires, quote, licensees engaged in the practice of public accountancy that they shall comply with all applicable professional standards, including but not limited to generally accepted accounting principles and generally accepted auditing standards. So as such, in accordance with this regulation, licensees in practice must abide by professional standard found in the AICPA Code of Professional Conduct, specifically related to due care, which further defines competence and is provided in your materials. Specifically, a CPA is responsible for assessing his or her own competence of evaluating whether education, experience, and judgment are adequate for the responsibility to be assumed. And while engaged in the practice of public accountancy, licensees are subject to a wide range of standards, including those promulgated by the AICPA, the Internal Revenue Service, the Government Accounting Office, Financial Accounting Standards Board. Whatever engagement they are engaged to perform, they have to be knowledgeable about those professional standards and abide by those. They must take the necessary due diligence to ensure that any public accounting service they perform are done so in accordance with those appropriate professional standards. And regardless of what a CPA is authorized to do, professional standards require the licensee is qualified and meets competency requirements. And so there is an important distinction between a CPA who is authorized by law to sign reports on attest engagements and a CPA who is also then qualified to perform work that they are hired to perform, and this would include signing those reports on attest engagements. And so in your materials, on page 2 of this item, we've provided some definitions related to authorized and qualified as they appear on the board's website, related to experience when an individual, when a member of the public would look that individual up on the license lookup feature. So at this time, I'll turn it back over to Chair Salazar, and I'll do my best to answer any members' questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Franzella. I'd like to invite our task force members for questions or comments on this one. Okay. All right. Hearing no questions or comments on this particular item, I would like to open this item up for public comment here at the Board of Accountancy. And seeing no public comment here at the Board of Accountancy, I would like to invite our moderator to open up the lines for public comment.
This is the moderator, and we've opened up the Q&A feature of WebEx to facilitate public comment. You can look for the question mark icon, type the word comment in the text box, and click send. As an alternative, you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon next to your name, or for call-in users, you may press *3 to raise your hand. And I do not see any requests for public comment at this time. Shall I close the Q&A?
Yes, moderator, please close the Q&A.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. So that concludes item number 8. And we move through to item number 9, and we have 2 folks who will be presenting the discussion and overview of the Board of Accountancy Advisory Committee's feedback regarding the necessity of a test experience requirement. We actually will be starting with, oh, did I skip one? I did. Sorry, apologies, 9. Discussion and overview regarding peer review reporting standards and how firm deficiencies correspond to receiving a pass with deficiencies or substandard peer review rating. My apologies, we do have two presenters. So I would like to welcome Ms. Center and Mr. DeLizer to engage in the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you and good afternoon. Michelle Center, I'm Licensing Chief here at the board. I will be co-presenting today, and I made sure to give them all the hard parts. Jeff DeLizer, he's chair of the Peer Review Oversight Committee, or PROC. The purpose of this item is to provide Cert members with information regarding the AICPA peer review program's process for determining peer review ratings. At the May Cert meeting, we provided Cert with an overview of the peer review program, including statistics on substandard peer reviews nationally and in California. Following that presentation, Cert requested additional information regarding peer review report ratings, including statistics for pass with deficiencies. And also the methodology for determining the peer review ratings, in particular, the differences between getting a pass with deficiency and those getting a substandard. I will now turn it over to the hard part of the presentation, Chair DeLizer.
All right, as previously discussed, the peer review reports give a rating of pass, pass with deficiencies, or substandard are the three options for reports. The ratings vary slightly depending on also whether or not the review is what is referred to as a system review or an engagement review. And at the bottom of page 2 in your materials and carrying on to page 3 are the definitions for the peer review ratings for system and engagement reviews. For system reviews, the distinction between a pass with deficiencies and a substandard is arrived at as a matter of professional judgment by the peer reviewer. And it uses kind of a holistic approach as to the entire comprehensive review is taken into consideration in a system review as to whether or not any deficiencies or findings noted in that peer review reflect on the system of quality control in its entirety. Generally, report acceptance bodies will review the documentation provided by a peer reviewer team captain and to evaluate the report rating that was arrived at by that team and accept those and determine whether or not that appears appropriate. For engagement reviews, the distinction between a pass with deficiencies and a substandard report is relatively straightforward. The difference is based on whether some or all of the engagements that were selected in the engagement review are identified as non-conforming. If an engagement is found to be non-conforming in any way, the firm will receive a peer review rating of substandard. However, the violation in that case may not necessarily be egregious, and in some cases it could be fairly minor if just a single engagement was selected and it was found to be non-conforming. Attachment 4 in the materials lists of a large list of examples of violations that would constitute non-compliance with the standards. Also included in the item are 2 tables. It's important to note the little footnote at the bottom of the page there that the national data included in these tables does not include California, and California is presented alone in its own column. Table 1 is titled System Reviews, and it includes by year the number of pass with deficiency and substandard reviews and is expressed as a percentage of total reviews in California. And then as well, that information is nationally excluding California. Table 2 is entitled Engagement Reviews, and again, it includes by year the number of pass with deficiency and substandard reviews expressed as a percentage of total reviews in, in California as well as nationally. With that, I will turn it back over to Chair Salazar, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for that. Task force members, comments, questions? Ms. Hines?
So this may be a function of me not being an accountant, but how is it determined whether or not a firm undergoes a system review versus an engagement review during the course of the peer review process?
It's primarily designed on the makeup of the firm's practice. Okay. If the firm performs audits, then it undergoes a system review. If that is its highest level of service, a form is just doing compilations, then it would be an engagement review.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Mr. Dustin?
Is it possible to have a pass with deficiencies or a fail report without actually having something wrong with the financial statements, since it is really a review of the quality control system of the firm?
Yes, in a system review, that is possible. If the financial statements were pristine, you could still have a failure to adhere to standards in the performance of the engagement.
Hold up.
Any idea percentage-wise, and I'm not asking you for empirical data, but does that happen often, or do you usually see things problematic with the financial statements themselves, or is it more the quality control system of the firm?
In my experience, I would say that typically financial statements are often accurate as to the accounting data. Most Attest performers are good accountants. Where a lot of the failures is on other disclosure standards and various other kind of unique aspects of an engagement or revenue recognition or something kind of difficult. If you look at that list on table 4, you'll see some of those items. And those are often accompanying with problems in the actual engagement performance as well. And so those two kind of go hand in hand a lot.
So I'm curious, you mentioned that there may be things like revenue recognition and other perhaps complex areas of accounting that may cause problems. How does the profession address something like that? How does somebody have competency to do that work done?
Typically through experience, through gaining that experience throughout their career, as well as continuing education and staying on top of changes in standards.
So obviously the necessity part of what we have here is looking at the 500 hours of experience to get an A license. So would you expect somebody with 500 hours of experience to have their arms wrapped around things like RevRec and other complex matters?
I don't know that I could speak intelligently to that. It would be a conjecture or my opinion. And that I
understand.
So we do have a staff input here.
So I'd just like to clarify, the 500 hours is a number. It represents that at that time, there might be a likelihood that an individual has completed a sufficient number of hours, steps, gotten the experience, but it's really a twofold kind of step that comes with the completion of the Attest experience requirement. Minimum 500 hours, and that you've completed I think it's 5 various categories, not only completed the work in that category, but have demonstrated to that supervisor that you understand that section and you can do that work in accordance with professional standards. So just equating it to 500 hours, it leaves off that second component that actually goes to the judgment of the licensee of whether or not a person has that requisite knowledge to be able to competently perform a test work with limited supervision.
Mr. Smithian?
Jeffrey, on the first table that you pointed to, when you compared the California, both the system reviews and the engagement reviews, you compared the California results, if you will, to the national account excluding California. So I don't know if it's statistically valid, but directionally it seems like the percentage of passive deficiencies in particular stood out in my mind, but even the substandard reports, the percentage of those firms are higher, in some cases statistically significantly higher than the rest of the country, I guess. So any insight with regard, are we just tough graders, or do we have a broader quality issue with the number of passive deficiencies? Because I think part of the objective of looking at this is, at least in my mind, is as we reflecting back, seems like a lifetime ago, but when we were talking about this in May, is there some indication that as a result of us having an increased requirement above what's out there, that perhaps our results should be statistically better. And I don't necessarily see that in this data. I don't know if we can draw that conclusion, but I don't. When I say better, I guess better. The percentage of firms going through peer review we'd have a fewer number of those firms with either the substandard category or the passive deficiencies.
I can see where it leads one to kind of look at that. There's a lot of variables that are not visible from this statistic, unfortunately. The type of clients, the type of engagements, there are certain types of engagements that may be more prevalent in businesses on the West Coast. And so you may see more auditors engaged in those kinds of environments. And so you would need to break this data down by engagement type, firm size, a lot of different things to basically start to draw conclusions as to how California fares in a particular engagement type, those kinds of things. There's just more data that you would need to really draw solid conclusions.
Science, do you have a comment?
Well, in addition to the fact that California is just better than everybody else, I have an additional, parking lot for the later discussion, which is, because it's kind of piggybacking on what you were saying, because we're such a large environment, and there is probably an opportunity for licensees to get exposure to a breadth of work because of the volume of work that's being performed here, that results in licensees being exposed to those kinds of, small details, like small, sort of niche issues that then would raise a problem or a challenge that you might not encounter in a state that doesn't have accounting firms that get these kinds of, peculiarities in work. So one of the question I had was more broadly, was there any concern about the difference between the percentages of deficiencies in California, the higher level of deficiencies in California versus other states? Because it may be that even though the number is higher, it's not a cause for concern because of something like, the additional data that's needed, the variety of firms that are, practicing here, the variety of the kind of work that's being, reviewed under the attestation process. So I wanted to, again, going back to staff, and I know I keep saying this, putting y'all on the spot, but, was there a reason or something that kind of stood out? And I guess also, I'm sorry, the committee as well, did you see this and did you have any concern, or did you just kind of, like you said, feel like, oh, there's some other context behind this and it doesn't create a reason for us to dig a little bit deeper and sort of figure out what the rationale is behind this?
If I understand the question correctly, yes, there are some things that we kind of look at when you look at a table. If we just take I'm going to steal this from you. If you just take the system review table 1, there's a few things to note here, and that is the early data back in 2013. California had recently required mandatory peer review back in 2013. I think that was the final year of a 3-year phase-in beginning in 10 or 11. Okay. And so you have a relatively new process to California at that point in time, as far as it covering. Prior to that point, it was voluntary, and so you have a lot of firms that were now involved in peer review or being peer reviewed that previously had not been. So you have that piece of data to kind of consider and look at. The second thing is over time, the AICPA modifies their program. The other thing that's happened in this large of a time span is the AICPA has engaged an oversight task force and does enhanced oversight of the peer review process. And so it has encouraged peer reviewers to basically award deficiencies more frequently than maybe they were in the past, particularly with system reviews. The other thing is when you look at a pass with deficiencies, that is basically a system of quality control that operates effectively with one or two minor exceptions and those deficiencies. It also gives that firm an opportunity to make improvements. They're then watched. And so a pass with deficiencies may not be something that causes a lot of alarm. And so if you kind of then focus a little more on the substandard with reviews and look at the kind of the transition there, and kind of the conformity more recently with the national average, you start to get a little more picture. Again, because this data is so broad, it's really difficult to drill down and go, okay, I know exactly what's causing this, and I know why it's either getting worse or improving and those kinds of things. But those are some general things that our committee kind of looks at when we're looking at this data in general terms.
Follow-up. Follow-up too. I know that AICPA is the peer review, standard, but does California add anything or enhance it, or is it just sort of the same? Everyone uses the same peer review, system across the country.
Yes, predominantly so. The AICPA actually provides the program of peer review. They basically created the process and the checklist and the program that is followed. That is followed almost uniformly across. There are a few states that have their own program for engagement reviews, but I am not aware of a competing peer review program for a system review in the U.S. And so it is the AICPA's program that everybody is following. California simply administers that program. And so they don't add to it, they follow it and they administer it here for the state.
And when you say California, the board does it, but the California Society of CPAs is actually performing
the administration
of it, just to clarify.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate all the comments. I concur with what has been said thus far. And yes, I did find Table 1 surprising, shocking, whatever, but the explanation makes a lot of sense. And given the timeline of when peer review became mandatory and et cetera, and changes, pass with deficiencies, it's like a laundry list of what is included on a pass with deficiency. You'd really have to analyze that, how to apply to a particular firm, et cetera, and really do a lot of detail work to really understand what that encompasses. You can have quite a few pass with deficiency findings before you even approach a substandard report. So it can be just kind of literally a bunch of items within their system of quality control that they can often easily clean up and get to where they have just a pass, with no other comments. And so there would have to be a real analysis of that, which would be a really tough charge to do. So yes, it makes me feel better to understand and to see that in substandard, we more parallel and align ourselves closely with the national finding. So just a comment, thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Dustin.
Just a little bit of clarification with the data that's in the table. Sure. Thank you. With respect to the system reviews and that data, is that peer reviews that were administered by the administrating entity, or does it also include those that are administered by the National Peer Review Committee, or is it combined? What data is in there with respect to peer reviews?
The national number would include all administering entities, and the California includes both, and you can correct me, I'm not sure where the source of this was, is both those administered by Cal Society as well as California firms administered by other states, and then as MPRC as well.
Thank you.
That's my understanding of the data. Okay.
It's a lot harder to get the data now, in as much as get specifics related to the data, because the AICPA manages that exclusively. So drill downs and other things are sometimes more complicated now that it's not just being able to go to the California Society. So I believe Mr. DeLizer's recap is correct.
Thank you. I have two comments. So I'm going to start with Ms. Lopez and then Mr. Dustin.
Thank you. My question has to do with a firm that has undergone peer review and receives a pass with deficiency result. Does that firm have an opportunity then to make corrections to then change the outcome of their peer review to pass?
They don't change the outcome. That peer review stands as a pass with deficiencies, but they are required to engage in certain corrective activity, either to correct an engagement if the reason for the deficiency was an engagement that was done incorrectly. They sometimes have to cure that engagement as part of their corrective action. Often the engagement is fine to be left alone, but they need to cure a problem with continuing education or some other practice in the firm, and they're required to make those corrective actions. The firm can request an expedited peer review. They can have a peer review done the next year. They've got all the corrections done, get a peer review done the next year and get a rating of pass, or they can wait till their next required peer review 3 years.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Dustin.
Thank you, Chair Salazar. I really just a comment. I want to thank you, Mr. Franzella and Mr. DeLizer. I apologize. I really asked the question because I wanted to draw out that, as was mentioned earlier, certainly California has a lot of more clients, a lot more complex clients. So I think it's hard to draw conclusions from a broad data set when there certainly are a lot more complex audits here, a lot more publicly traded companies here. So I don't think that we need to necessarily focus too much on that broad data. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think maybe I just, in the attempt to synthesize all of the materials and all of the discussion, I guess I'm going to go on a limb and ask if I can have feedback from our presenters. When I look at this, I am not seeing declines in substandard or alarm bells going off within these tables. And so I guess I would just, I believe I heard you say the focus on egregious audits. I think we're concerned about audit failures, bad audits, and that would be the focus on substandard. And I'm not seeing declining, increasing percentage numbers of substandard reviews within California. So I think when I look at this and go, okay, well, this is not representing a warning flag for the Board of Accountancy. Did you have a different conclusion, or is there concern in even making that sort of broad stroke from the recent percentages in substandard? Is it overreaching?
I don't come to a different conclusion than that. I do think that as we look at broad data like this, there's a lot of conclusions that could be drawn from here. Many may be misleading because the data is so broad, but I think that kind of one general is to kind of compare it to that national average on the substandard. Pass with deficiencies, there's a lot of latitude there. The reviewer has a lot of latitude on what constitutes, because you can have things that they detect that are incorrect in the system of quality control that doesn't rise to the level of deficiency. And so you can have other comments that are lesser, and there's a lot of latitude for reviewers. But I think that much of that data in the pass with deficiencies column is changes to the standards, changes to the process of peer review, changes to how the AICPA has written their program, and those kinds of things drive a lot of that statistic. So I think it is appropriate to focus on the other statistic, and when you do, you don't get as many alarm bells. It would probably be inappropriate to say there's not a problem, everything is fine because I see this data is in line with the national average at 8% by 2020. That's probably too far overreach, but you can kind of look at it and get some general sense. I guess that's not actually an answer.
Well, it seems like the general sense is that we are not uniquely different in this measurement from the national performance.
Correct. I think that is fair.
That is a safe conclusion. All right. Any additional comments from our committee, Mr. Smidian?
I might be beating this thing to death here, but I'm going to keep going. The latitude you referred to with regard to the passive deficiencies, and I agree, there's some subjectivity on who's doing the peer review, what their experience would be. We have two different peer reviewers looking at the same facts, and one might issue a passive deficiency, and someone else might say it's just passing. I think when you refer to the latitude, I think you're referring to, and I would say that this data would indicate that the program we have in place with the number of passive deficiencies, which are significantly higher, at least on a percentage-wise, provides us an additional safeguard that, in the context of what we're here talking about, the initial licensing, is something we would consider as a very positive thing. I mean, not to pick on the firms, but the fact that there is this level of this high percentage of passive deficiencies says somebody's looking at this stuff with a high level of scrutiny. And I think from that standpoint, I think if we could keep that in mind as we go through this discussion with regard to whether we need this entrance pass of 500 hours when we know there's something like this that appears to be working. Look, it's the same audit standards. It's the same peer review program. And they have just as much complex companies in New York and Florida and Texas and some of the other places they do in California. And having worked at a national firm, sometimes you get to see that. So I don't know if there's something unique about what's happening here in our state that would cause us to have a different requirement.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? Okay. With that, I'd like to ask for any public comment here at the Board of Accountancy. And seeing no public comment, I'd like to invite our moderator to open for public comment online, please.
This is the moderator, and we've opened up the WebEx Q&A feature to facilitate public comment. If you'd like to make a comment on this item, you can look for the question mark icon, typically in the lower right corner of your computer screen, type the word comment and click send. The other option is to raise your hand to be recognized, and you may do that by clicking on the hand icon, or if you are a call-in user, you may push *3 to raise your hand. Each person will have 5 minutes to speak. And I do not see any requests for public comment. Shall I close that feature?
Yes, moderator, please close public comments.
Thank you.
And that concludes item number 9, and we move along to 10, which is now discussion and overview of the Board of Accountancy Advisory Committee's feedback regarding the necessity of the test experience requirement. And I would like to go ahead, since we have Mr. DeLizer at the table, I'd like to go ahead and start with Mr. DeLizer, if you are ready to comment.
Yes. My name is, in case anybody forgot from the last item, is Jeff DeLizer. I am the chair of the Peer Review Oversight Committee, or the PROC, which I'll refer to it in this. And I'll begin today's discussion by providing an overview of this agenda item with the input from the PROC. And then I'll turn it over to Mr. Aguilera, who is the chair of the Enforcement Advisory Committee, followed then by Mr. Williams, the chair of the Qualifications Committee. All three committees were recently presented with an item regarding this task force request for committee members to provide their input on the necessity of the Attest experience requirements for CPA licensure. Members were reminded that their input should be considered from the perspective as a member of their respective committees, and that consumer protection should be at the forefront of the discussion. At our recent PROC meeting, we had just that discussion, and there was unanimous support for the necessity of the experience requirement from the members of the PROC. And I'll try to summarize that without editorializing it too terribly much. And in doing that, I'll focus on three themes that seem to kind of reverberate all of the comments from our group. The first of which is the complexity and the importance of attestation work. The second theme was how the experience requirement fits into a multi-pronged approach to service quality and consumer protection. And then lastly, the importance of the experience or the apprenticeship model in developing expertise. First, the complexity and importance of attestation work. Members identified various consumer groups, including creditors, lenders, investors, and government agencies that rely heavily on attestation reports in order to make loans, investments, and other critical financial and operational decisions. Members stated that these agencies put a great degree of trust in CPAs to provide expertise and quality service that meets a high level of standard. This trust is established by and it's dependent upon the CPA's experience and practical knowledge. Members stated that it takes years to gain this experience and knowledge necessary to properly perform attestation engagements. And the discussion noted that attestation engagements and audits in particular are very complicated, and the consequences resulting from inadequate knowledge or inadequate expertise can include irreparable harm to those reliant consumer groups, and litigation amongst those parties is often involved. The professional standards for attestations are expected to be followed in the performance of these engagements and are not something that can be learned solely through initial or continuing classroom education. The members discussed the complexity of these standards as evidenced by errors and mistakes made by licensed CPAs and peer review issues that come before our committee. The next theme, the experience as a component of a multi-pronged approach to quality and consumer protection. Members made a point about experience being a critical but not the only backstop to protect consumers. Since we are the peer review oversight committee, members agreed that peer reviews as well as enforcement activities related to those sometimes are very important to consumer protection. However, members pointed out that those activities happen after the attestation engagement has already been completed. The peer review is a detection rather than a prevention kind of mechanism. It's after any errors that have occurred have already occurred at that point. Members agreed that peer reviews represent a high quality standard, but since only a sample of engagements are reviewed, they do not always shine a light on errors that may be there within other engagements. And this creates the necessity for other backstops, such as education and experience requirements, in order to complete consumer protection. Members also expressed specific concern that without a test experience requirement, firms and sole practitioners may no longer require engagements to be done by qualified staff with specific knowledge, training, and experience. The last theme was the experience or apprenticeship model. Members spoke about how this model provides a backstop for consumer protection and ensures that the stakeholder confidence in the attestation engagements. CPAs need practical on-the-job experience to achieve the necessary competency. Similar to the medical field, a doctor would not be placed in an operating room immediately following the completion of medical school. The doctor would first be required to assist, observe, and practice in order to gain that experience. This model is also present in numerous other technical fields where skilled performance is essential. Apprenticeship is inherent to any profession that requires expertise. Thank you for seeking the input of our committee. And at this time, I will turn it over to Mr. Aguilera, unless you'd like to address questions in between.
No, we would like to proceed to Mr. Aguilera.
Thank you, Mr. DeLizer. I'm Doug Aguilera. I'm the chair of the Enforcement Advisory Committee. Our committee has 13 members, and we met in July. And at our July meeting, we had 8 members, and one of those members was Ms. Johnson. So she recused herself from comments. So that left 7 of us. We didn't have a unanimous opinion, and there was very little discussion. So I'm not sure how helpful our committee is going to be, but I'll tell you, give you some of the highlights. One member noted that they believe that the 500 hours of attest experience could be handled by the market. In other words, that there wouldn't be that necessity that the market would take care of it. In other words, if you did bad audits, you wouldn't have a business. A member noted that there are professional standards in place. If other states are using professional standards as the main framework, the necessity of the 500 hours is less important. So those are, I think, reactive approaches. And now I'm going to tell you what another member, what I had to say. So as a forensic accountant who provides litigation support services and expert witness testimony, I've evaluated lots of audits and auditors, and also as chair of the Enforcement Advisory Committee, we do that. So if I'm involved, it's not good. You know, something has gone wrong. So I'm jaded, I have to tell you that. I'm biased that way. But, you know, the 500 hours is a guardrail to ensure that the licensees with a CPA license with a test authority are qualified to provide attest services and be competent in those services. I think that that's just the minimum, and that you can't have enough experience and training. And even with these 500 hours, there's still failures. And when I was looking at table 1 in the last presentation, I was thinking, okay, we were doing, let's just say that our failures were consistent with the nation. I wondered what would happen if we took away this 500-hour experience requirement, if we would then become, we wouldn't compare as favorably with the rest of the nation. So I feel very strongly that there is a necessity for these 500 hours, and everything that the proc said, the committee said, I would agree with. So that concludes the summary that I have, and I will turn it over to Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilera. Hello, my name is Michael Williams. I am the chair of the Qualifications Committee, or QC. I will continue today's discussion by presenting the QC's input. As with the other advisory committees that presented before me, QC members were requested to provide input on the necessity of the attest experience requirements from their perspective as members of the QC, and with a focus on consumer protection. There was considerable report for the necessity of the attest experience requirement from the QC members. Members agreed that attest engagements are highly technical and specialized type of work that impacts consumers, business entities, investors, and the general public. CPAs who conduct comprehensive audits and sign off on attest engagements must be able to understand risk and materiality. Members explained that without the attest experience requirement, audits may not be properly completed and in accordance with professional standards. Members noted that at times the QC has interviewed firms where the supervisors have verified an applicant's attest experience from the perspective of what they believe the applicant can do rather than what this applicant has done. Members explain that this is evident when they delve into the applicant's experience in planning and performing audits, and the applicant is unfamiliar with the process. By interviewing applicants and firms, the QC provides a second level of review for attest experience to ensure consumer protection by verifying the applicants for licensure meet the minimum level of experience necessary to perform attest engagements. Members stated that there is a large amount of professional judgment involved in the CPA profession, and the apprenticeship model supports CPAs learning through repetition and experience on how to make informed judgments. Without the attest experience requirement, there is the loss of a framework for knowing if someone can make sound professional judgments specifically related to attest services. The committee pointed out that there is a significant amount of risk involved when CPAs conduct engagements, and the apprenticeship model is necessary to reduce that risk by supporting the development of auditing skills through experience. Members pointed out when consumers think of CPAs, they think of audits and taxes. Because many consumers don't recognize that there are two different types of authority for CPAs, it places additional responsibility on the CBA to ensure that applicants have the appropriate test experience to perform the work they are authorized for. Thank you for seeking input from the QC. At this time, I will turn back to Chair Salazar.
All right, I'd like to thank all three of our chairs for their comments and open it up to our task force members for discussion. Let's start with Ms. Corrigan.
I want to thank our advisory committee chairs for their very helpful and informative information. Very important decision that the task force is facing. I guess one comment that I need to deal with was from the one particular, I guess, EAC member, but the having the market control or just figuring, you know, you're doing a poor job. So yes, eventually there will be no demand for that firm. But in the wake of that, how many disasters are happening? I believe that the education experience, you know, requirements, testing requirements are to prevent as much as possible something like that happening in the real thrust of consumer protection. And the after fact, doing it after the fact isn't really meaningful at all. You know, many, as a practitioner, as a CPA, and what I see in enforcement, that sort of thing, many clients have no idea that their CPA is doing a poor job until something goes wrong. They have no idea. And so it seems to me that you know, that particular view just doesn't fly well in the light of consumer protection and letting the market determine, yeah, eventually that CPA might find their way out of a job because enough goes wrong. And that's like saying, well, let's let all the doctors go and practice. And yes, some people might die and eventually they'll find their way out of practice. I mean, I don't think we want to look at it that way. At least I don't want to. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you.
All right, additional comments from our Ms. Hines?
Yeah, that whole notion of like the market being the control and the backstop here, that stood out to me. And I didn't make comment about it before because I thought maybe it was just me being a little sensitive. But when we were back on item number, I'm just, you know, scrolling through my documents, but we were on item number 6. And we were talking about the enforcement division processing times. And there was this statement, the goal is to allow market forces to elevate the profession by directing consumers away from licensees with troubled records. And I was like, no, how about we get rid of the troubled record holders and, you know, that being the way that we really protect consumers, not wait until and be reactive and wait until, you know, they do something that really puts a consumer in a, you know, situation in which they're now paying the price because the defense, because their accountant messing up isn't always going to be an adequate defense for them. So it really is upon the Board of Accountancy to make sure that we continue to maintain standards that protect our consumers. And, you know, that's why it's important that we're having this whole discussion about this attestation, you know, requirement and the necessity and how we evaluate, you know, the qualifications and expertise of the of the firms and the licensees that are performing these services. I also just want to thank you all for giving us that feedback as well. Particularly, the laying out the themes, Mr. DeLizer, the themes that your committee raised. I think that was a really helpful framework within which we can have this discussion and thinking about and evaluating this necessity element. Because I think I was already kind of, trying to figure out, like, how do I define what would necessity be? And I think that really gave a great roadmap for me to really, process and digest all the information that we're getting.
Thank you. And I think as chair, I have a question, so I'll call on myself. So my question is, as I try to unpack this, is for Mr. Williams, and I'm going to ask you to maybe take your cert hat off and put on your chair hat on. I heard what your committee wanted to convey, and I thought it was really important. Where I struggle a little bit was, we had some materials today, which I will just repeat to refresh them. Item 8, which was the requirements to adhere to standards. And the thing in that document that stuck out to me is the distinction between the authorization in the 500 hours and the qualification to provide competent professional services. And your presentation from your committee touched on that, but it makes me question, did your committee dig into that? Because what I heard was your committee is seeing that the 500 hours it's kind of supporting this idea that they're very separate notions, that the 500 hours doesn't necessarily equate to competence. And this authorization is a number. And so, I'm sort of trying to struggle with, the definitions of the distinction between the two, and if that was considered. And I see Mr. Franzella, so you might have something to comment on to help me out of this logic circle I am struggling with.
Again, it's more just to point out the 500-hour part of the discussion. That's not the commonplace. Is 500 hours is not the commonplace to get signed off on. Is it 500 hours? There's that component, and that's where the QC really comes in. When they're doing their interviews, we might question certain areas of the QC, staff at the forefront, and then the QC after the fact, that we might see somebody with 1,000 hours. But depending on where those hours are broken out, how they look, they delve in not to the hours per se, they're delving into the signer's knowledge of a particular professional standards or a particular section than the applicant. So there's more to it than the 500 hours. And I just don't want the committee to have this misconception that once they hit 500 hours, the supervisor signs the form and everything's all well and good. It's usually significantly higher, and anybody who works for a big firm would generally probably say it's significantly longer. We're probably talking 2,000 hours or more before the big firms will sign off on them. And that is more of the commonplace of what we see is higher hours. So the authorized, the qualified, I think those are important pieces. Like you're explaining, yes, the board only gives you the authorization to do it. You have to make that professional judgment that you are actually qualified to do it in accordance with those professional standards. So there is that distinction, but the 500 hours it was really something that was put in place, I want to say, in the early 2000s as a means of people were asking, when can I ask my supervisor to start evaluating signing my form? And that's kind of how that number kind of got put in place. It doesn't hold any more water than that's where we start. So.
Thank you. Wait, did Mr. Williams, did you want to add a comment in there?
No, I would, I'm not allowed, I don't know what I'm allowed to address, so I think that he did a fine job of expressing that. The 500 hours, we look at, as a committee member, when we're looking at candidates, we recognize the hours, but then we look at the work. And you have to they may have 2,000 hours, but have 5 hours of planning, and you can tell that they don't have, and that's, planning is probably the most important part of an audit.
Thank you for that. Ms. Hines?
I'm struggling with whether whether this is a comment for now or whether this is a comment for, where I feel like I'm going for item number 12. But I'm going to throw it out here now, and you can tell me whether I should parking lot it. But it really feels like this 500 hours, we're looking at it as, or we've been talking about, or let me back up. As a layperson, I've been interpreting it more as a floor, more as a gate. Like once you hit that 500 hours, you now are in the realm of qualification for that attestation experience. But based upon what we've been reading and what we've been hearing today, it really is more a floor. And, it's like once you hit that floor, you're in the building of attestation, but you don't get a pass out until you've satisfied all of these other elements. And, and one of them is the quality of the experience, like really evaluating the quality of your experience, your attestation experience before you are signed off as being an expert. So this is both a comment during our discussion now, but I also am making a note to myself to make sure that it comes up as part of the discussion when we get to item 12, whatever decision we decide to make. But I want to make sure that, we incorporate that, because I think it will be helpful when we take it to the full board, to have the discussion about whatever decision we make, how we really delved into looking at this necessity question and evaluating it.
Mr. Franzella, do you have a comment?
Only that depending on the outcome of, they are interrelated, the 500 hours, the necessity, but a lot of what this committee will undertake, depending on the recommendation, is that particular topic of the 500 hours, how that interplays with sufficiency. If the attest model is continued, or at least the necessity aspect is recommended to maintain, then we'll pivot to sufficiency and start talking about the number of hours, the form itself, what kind of makes up some of that information, and, and talking about that floor methodology, ceiling, being in the building, all of those things would probably come up in that subsequent discussion, again, contingent on the necessity factor.
All right, Mr. Smidian?
One of the things I have to remind myself of, that when we talk about the 500 hours or whatever that translates to in terms of demonstrating that knowledge, that is so that somebody can sign an audit report, which I kind of equate to somebody at sort of the highest level of their firm. Now, if they're a one-person firm, that's it. But it's somebody at the highest level of their of the structure within their firm. But there are thousands, and probably more than half of the people who are participating in audit engagements who may never get certified, who aren't certified. They might have had staff people working with me for years that never passed the exam. Some never took the exam. And in order to demonstrate that they had the qualifications, they were gaining experience, certainly, but there was continuing education. There were other things that had to be done. But the 500 hours didn't impact their audit quality. It was all those other things that we had in place. So we're talking about specifically a requirement so somebody can sign an audit report, not to get into the game, not to get in to come and participate in an audit engagement, because you have local firms using staff where half the time they might have been doing tax for the first 2 years, and they get an audit and they shift them over and they're doing, and they train them, but they're doing an audit, but they may never sign an audit report the rest of their life. Doesn't mean they did a substandard job. They did train them, they had to go through all of that. So I just want to remind and I have to remind myself, we're talking about a requirement to sign the report. And I think that's it's a different question.
I think that's a good comment to highlight as well. So as we think of sort of our wrapping comments here, I have one more. And hearing Mr. Williams talk about the role of the QC from the perspective of the chair, I'm reminded that the PROC report referenced national statistics, and I guess I realized I'm curious if we have knowledge about what other states do. They're substantially equivalent, but if they don't have an attest experience requirement, is there an equivalent for the QC elsewhere? I guess it's just a new area. I just not really thought about what do other states do, and that may or may not be relevant to our discussion, but in terms of comparing ourselves to other substantially equivalent organizations, it would be interesting to hear.
So are you asking if another state has presumably it'd have to be a state who has an attest experience requirement, and whether or not they have a substantially related committee such as the qualifications committee?
Maybe, I mean, maybe I'm challenging the statement that I've now forgotten, that there was a really compelling one Mr. Williams' point he was making about, you know, the role that's being fulfilled in terms of helping ensure that licensees are knowledgeable. And so I guess, do other states dig into the absent an attest requirement? Do other states dig deeper into the, you know, just the 1 year UAA experience? Do they get any level of detail? Do they ever question that? Do they do something different with education? You know, we have our own model here, but I'm reminded everyone else, you know, all states are different. And is there an equivalent function to the QC with initial licensure elsewhere? That's, I think, my question.
I don't know. Honestly, I think some of the uniqueness is what the qualifications committee is exploring. They have a fairly targeted experience requirement that they're looking at as related to a test, and it's an opinion-based form. They're opining on whether or not the individual not only performed the work, but did so in accordance with the professional standards and has that knowledge to do that work. If you look at the UAA model that we have as well within our general experience requirement, you're not rendering an opinion as a CPA when you're signing off on that general experience. You're indicating the individual performed the work in accordance with professional standards, but you're not opining on whether or not that individual has the knowledge and understanding like you do in the attest experience. So I'm not sure so the QC doesn't normally delve into that particular area on knowledge experience as it relates to how that general experience requirement. So I'm not sure other states would actually have a model that would incorporate that. So I'm not familiar with anything like that though.
But I think what you just shared is illuminating. So thank you. That is still helpful for me. Any other comments for our 3 committee chairs from our task force members? Okay, Mr. Centini.
I think I'd like to ask Mr. Franzella, but it's kind of a general question, and again, I'll use it on a later agenda item. Is there anything impracticable, or just difficult about having the 2 license approach, where maybe the 500 hours was a difficult thing that came up, in your experience?
So in as much as there is part of what the Cert committee may do, depending on its activities and its recommendations, there are some areas where having the dual license creates some policy conflicts or some questions and concerns that, you know, and it's taken a long time to kind of get to this point. The G license, while it's been around for about 20 years now, is still relatively new in terms of regulating the profession in California. And so we're now, after 20 years, starting to see some of the maybe holes or gaps within the Accountancy Act, within the regulations, within the regulation of the profession that need to be addressed, related to how G licensees can, you know, function within certain attest environments, gain experience, other things of that nature, reciprocal licenses, and so on. So there are some issues and concerns that have arisen, and that's part of the discussions that Cert will need to have over time.
All right. Thank you. So I'm looking around and I don't see any additional member comments on item 10 that is in front of us. So at this point, I'd like to ask if there is any public comment here at the Board of Accountancy. And seeing no public comment here at the Board of Accountancy, I would like to invite our moderator to please open for public comment online.
This is the moderator, and we've opened up the WebEx Q&A feature to facilitate public comment. If you've got a comment on item 10, you can look for the question mark icon, typically in the lower right corner of your WebEx screen. Click that, and in the text box, type the word comment and click send. The other option is to raise your hand. You may do that by clicking on the hand icon next to your name. And if you are a call-in user, you can push *3 to raise your hand. Each person will be given 5 minutes to speak. And I do not see any requests for public comment. Shall I close that feature?
Yes, moderator, please close this feature.
Thank you.
All right, so public comment is closed, and that concludes item 10. So with that, I would like to thank our chairs for bringing this important information at our committee's request as well as the board's request. So thank you very much. With that, it is 1:45, and I'd like to invite our task force to take a 15-minute recess so that we can take a break. And moderator, if you could communicate that as well online with putting some visual image up for our folks following that we will be on break. So we will resume at 2 p.m. Thank you. Hello and welcome back to the Cert Task Force meeting. It is 2 o'clock. We have just concluded prior to our break item 10, and we'll be moving on to item 11 on our agenda. And so I'd like to invite Mr. Franzella to present the discussion overview of the Attest Experience Requirement Survey.
Thank you, Chair Salazar. So the purpose of this agenda item is to provide the task force with an overview of a comparative results from the 2015 and 2022 Attest Experience Requirement Surveys. So a bit of background. Beginning in 2015, the CBA had contracted with a consulting firm to conduct a comprehensive survey asking California stakeholders general questions regarding California's Attest Experience requirement, and included various participation groups, including CPAs, new CPAs, applicants, experienced CPAs, hirers, and signers of the Attest Experience form, and consumers. The survey ran from August 2015 to October 2015, and the results of that survey were presented to the CBA in March 2016. And with that survey, the CBA received just over 10,000 respondents. So after the Cert's last meeting, staff recognized we had an extended opportunity or extended amount of time, so took the opportunity to resurrect that survey. Between the meetings, we recreated the survey using the same questions with the exception of one additional question inquiring if individuals had previously participated in the 2015 survey, but otherwise they are question for question. That allowed it to be quickly drafted, launched, and marketed, and allowed for some comparative results as much as possible between the 2015 and 2022 surveys. And the survey ran from June 15 to August 15th of this year. And the full report is included in agenda item, the attachment for this agenda item. And during this 2-month window, we received just over 3,300 responses. So in the attachment, each chart is associated with one of the questions, and the questions are broken out into the various groups. Obviously, we had far fewer respondents this time, so in some areas there might be very few responses. The percentages would be similar, but you're comparing maybe 600 to somebody to in 2015 to say 6 in 2022. But it was designed to provide CERT members with some additional empirical data that we could provide as quickly as possible, and hope that it is useful for members' discussions today and going forward. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the chair, and I'll do my best to answer members' questions.
Thank you for that, Mr. Franzella. I would like to ask our task force members for any comments or questions about the survey. And thank you for pulling that information together. It's very helpful. Ms. Hines, do you have a comment?
I was trying to wait. I don't want to I know I've been talking a lot, but I have a lot of highlighting in this section. So one of the things that stood out to me that I was kind of keeping track of throughout this was that pretty much, I think, all of the categories of respondents, the majority seem to support the continued attestation requirement, you know, at a minimum a modification, but it's still a pretty significant number seem to, you know, responded affirmatively to retaining the attestation requirement. And then, you know, sort of following up on the feedback from the 3 committees that we had, it seemed pretty consistent, you know, their rationale for, you know, how they felt about the attestation. So it was really helpful to give us an additional context about how the licensee community, you know, feels about it. Because I kind of would have expected that the licensees would see this as a burden or as a, you know, something that, you know, was at least, you know, a challenge to have, you know, sort of facing them in their, you know, professional experience. And also, I can see how this is a little bit of a challenge to the licensees' ability to exercise their judgment and trusting that they're not going to engage in something that they're not able to do. But seeing the responses and the comments about the fact that they felt like the attestation requirement was still important, and even, you know, talking about how it was relevant to their practice areas and the ways in which it enhanced their practice areas and the ways in which important and significant. It was very helpful context, you know, to me. And I'll stop there, and maybe as we're having more of a robust, you know, discussion, I'll bring up some of the specifics. But, you know, that's an overview, you know, overall sort of impression I had of it.
Thank you for that. Are there specific questions about how it's pulled together? Any of the specific charts? Okay. Okay. So seeing no specific comments or questions from our committee, further comments or questions, and I think Ms. Hines is on point here with saying I think elements of this may inform our discussion later, but it doesn't seem like we have a lot of inquiry about it. So I've kind of drawn this out as much as I can. There's still no questions, and so I would like to open for public comment here in the Sacramento headquarters of the Board of Accountancy. And not seeing any, I would like to invite our moderator to please open up for online questions.
This is the moderator, and we've opened up the WebEx Q&A feature to facilitate public comment. If anyone has any comment, they can look for the question mark icon, typically in the lower right corner of your computer screen. Type the word comment and click send. The other option is to raise your hand. You may do that by clicking on the hand icon, or if you are a call-in user, you may push *3 to raise your hand. Each person will have 5 minutes to speak. And I do not see any requests for public comment. Shall I close that feature?
Yes, moderator, please close public comment.
Thank you.
All right, that concludes item 11, and I would like to invite Mr. Franzella to move along to 12.
Thank you. So the purpose of this agenda item is to serve as an opportunity for the task force to discuss a possible recommendation to the CBA regarding the experience requirement for CPA licensure. Cert is being asked to decide whether it wishes to provide a recommendation regarding the necessity component of the primary question regarding the attest experience requirement. At its previous meeting, Cert members discussed various topics and raised various questions regarding the attest and journal accounting experience requirement as related to California and nationally. These topics were highlighted in Ms. Salazar's agenda item 3 and are noted again on the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2 of this item. Additionally, as noted by Chair Salazar under item 3, the CBA established a primary question for Cert's review. Is the present attest experience requirement necessary and sufficient to support the CBA's mission to protect consumers by ensuring only qualified licensees practice public accountancy in accordance with professional standards? This agenda item gives Cert the opportunity to discuss an initial recommendation regarding the need to continue to require applicants to complete an attest experience requirement for those wanting to sign reports on attest engagements. So in your materials on page 2, staff have highlighted, based on the discussions, 2 bullet points that would likely occur after any recommendation is made, depending on the type of recommendation. But I'd like to provide a little bit more context to that before I cover those 2 bullets. First, based on any recommendation today, before we would delve into those 2 bullets, this committee would, or the chair would provide the final recommendation to the board at its November meeting on this topic to get any feedback and comments from the board on that recommendation. And then also, based on that type of recommendation, then we would bump into those 2 bullets. So if there was a recommendation by this committee to maintain the attest experience requirement as necessary, and the board concurred with that, then staff would be working with the chair to start the process of plotting out that second part of the question, the sufficiency element of that question. If the task force were to recommend that it is no longer necessary and presented that to the board and the board agreed, then we would be looking at that second bullet related to if there's any potential backstops related to the elimination of a test experience requirement. And when I'm saying backstops, it doesn't mean that there actually has to be one, but just in the instances that there could be other alternatives to the attest experience requirement, being a pre-licensure model or an individual model. It could be something that's placed on a firm or firm's personnel, similar to what NASBA has been discussing at a national level on a test firm licensure. There are other avenues that the board could direct the task force to be exploring related to that. So at this time, I'll turn discussions back over to Chair Salazar, and I'll do my best to answer members' questions.
Thank you very much for that. And we already have a hand raised. So, Ms. Corrigan.
Thank you, Chair Salazar. I appreciate all the effort of CBA staff and everything that's gone into the information that's been provided along, again, with our advisory committee chairs. This time, I would like to move for the Cert task force to recommend to the CPA that the attest experience requirement is necessary for licensing CPAs in California. Thank you.
So we have a motion for a first on the table. Do we have a second? Ms. Hines?
I'd like to second Ms. Corrigan's motion.
Okay, thank you. We have a first and a second. So now we're able to open this up for the wider discussion and maybe address some of those parking lot items previously. Comments? Ms. Lopez?
Thank you, Chair Salazar. I do appreciate the motion, and I will be supporting the motion. Particularly, one of the comments that Mr. DeLizer made earlier, based on the feedback from the Proc committee, was that one of the themes that his members discussed included the complexity and the expertise needed in this field. And then to bolster that for me in my head, Ms. Corrigan mentioned that clients are depending on that expertise and the complexity of the work that is being done. And they are putting a lot of trust on the accountants that are performing that work. And for that reason, I do believe Attest experience is a way to get to that, to understanding all of that complexity and getting to that level of expertise that would be needed to perform the work successfully. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Additional comments? Sure. Mr. Santini?
Chair Salazar, could we state the motion again, please?
We have a motion for the Cert committee to recommend that the current Attest experience requirement is necessary. I'm not seeing any hands, so I love being, Mr. Simidian, because I'll jump in with my contrarian view when y'all are ready. Mr. Simidian, please.
I guess I'll beat you to the punch then, I think. Although I agree with the comments that have been made with regard to the complexity and the quality and all of those elements, which I think are just really critical to the role that we play, as the role that CPAs play with regard to the supporting credit decisions and all the matters that were raised earlier, as well, and obviously the public confidence in that information. I don't believe the 500 hours as it's currently structured addresses that. I think there are other safeguards, there are other elements within the statute that adequately address the quality that is needed, the education that is needed, but putting in this 500-hour requirement in order for somebody to be able to sign an audit report, or removing that, I should say, doesn't detract from that in any ways. I disagree. I don't think it's necessary. I think that's sort of a very, it's a very strong word. I think when you say, is it necessary? Meaning, if we didn't have the 5 hours, I think the comment was made earlier by one of the committee members was, what would happen to the results of the peer review if that would happen? And I would say it's indifferent. It wouldn't impact it at all. I just don't think it's relevant to the question of audit quality and consumer protection.
Thank you for those comments. Additional comments, Mr. Santini?
Well, I was just reading the rest of the statement that we had, and is it necessary to protect consumers by ensuring that only qualified licensees, only? So I'll stop there and just ask a question. Is that our goal? Only? So we want to make sure that that every single CPA is a qualified CPA performing these things. That sounds like a bit of a task, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dustin?
Thank you, Chair Salazar. I actually went at this a couple of different ways, and you'll have to bear with me for a second. And I first started looking at this and asked myself, does the consumer in California really know the difference between an A and a G license? And I would say probably not. And I said, okay, what about an informed consumer, perhaps a banker, perhaps a business entity that uses the services? And again, I'm not really sure that even an informed consumer knows the difference between an A and a G license. I considered the enforcement aspects, and I don't really see a lot of enforcement activity with respect to substandard work being done. And I will tell you, at the national level, I spent some time in the last month looking for examples of where individuals practicing through mobility in different jurisdictions are being found to do substandard work in another state. And while there are some examples, a lot of them are based on federal regulatory agencies and other types of work, not consumer complaints about substandard work. And so I then turned the corner, and please bear with me a little bit. I said, well, we're really talking about necessity today. And is it necessity, or is it belts and suspenders, if I use a term that the legal profession uses? And to me, it's more belts and suspenders, because So long as I get that 500 hours, which is a floor, which may be more than 500 hours, and maybe 1,000, maybe whatever that number is to meet the qualification committee standards, it doesn't mean that 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, I have the competence to sign an audit report. It's a place and time, just like when you assess education, experience, or somebody passes a CPA exam. Certainly we look and we spend some time looking at peer review. And certainly the results, you could look at that data and say, well, we're not really doing too well in California, but I think we've all discussed that earlier and concluded that certainly if you look at substandard work, things have improved in the last 12 years. And that is one of those additional belts and suspenders that every firm that does attest work has to do. Again, you look at mobility and there's not a lot of issues there. And frankly, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about what happens in a lot of the other jurisdictions, those that don't have the 500-hour requirement or any requirement for licensure. And the fact of the matter is that most of those jurisdictions rely on the 1 year of general experience in a plethora of areas in accordance with the Uniform Accountancy Act. And if we go again to the peer review data, you don't see that those states that have that type of licensure model have a higher degree of substandard work than you have here. And I think that if you look at 500 hours, it's a minimum of 3.5 months if you say it's 40 hours a week. And I don't think that's sufficient on the job training that somebody has. I think whether you work under a G license or an A license, ultimately the firm that you're working for is the firm that has to be responsible that you as an individual are meeting the requirements of the profession, whether it's professional standards or peer review or CPE. And I was glad to hear the discussion about CPE because that's another area, again, the belts and suspenders. So I think overall what California has is significant compared to what other jurisdictions may have. And I don't know that the 500 hours is necessary when you look at the total environment that exists in California. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Reactions, input, questions, Ms. Hines?
Well, I don't know so much as turn my microphone, and not so much a reaction as just clarifying that we're talking about the attest experience requirement broadly. We're not talking about the elements of the attest experience yet. And isn't that right? Or are we, I mean, the number of hours that are required and the quality of experience that is expected is the second question we are supposed to get to. Right now, what we agreed to do was segregate the two, divide it into two issues. And right now we're evaluating the first component, which is the necessity. Is it necessary to have an attestation experience requirement licensing, to protect consumers? If it is necessary, then what is adequate or sufficient to qualify someone to gain this licensing? We could decide today, it's not necessary to have an attestation requirement. Other states don't have it. They somehow manage to protect their consumers. Again, as a layperson, I can guarantee I don't know the difference really between, and I've been on this board for a number of years, and I still, as a layperson, don't really know how I would go out and find an accountant. I just would, presume that if I presented my need to an accountant who is qualified, that they would then say yeah, I can do that, or no, I can't do that. And I would rely upon their assertion. So I appreciate as a member of this board that this board, provides a stamp of approval, and I can trust that that licensee is representing themselves appropriately. But back to what we were talking about, we're really only talking about, is the attestation experience requirement necessary? And I think that everything that we've talked about for me has supported the question, that has answered the question that, yes, it continues to be necessary. regardless of what other jurisdictions may do. And then the next part will be the staff coming to us and helping us to evaluate the sufficiency of it. And I have to say, to both the point that Mr. Smidian and Mr. Dustin have made, I do believe that we need to have a much more robust discussion about the sufficiency conversation. Even if we decide to get to the decision that it is sufficient, I do believe that it's helpful for us to discuss why it might be sufficient, or if it's not sufficient, then give some direction about what we need to do in order to explain, why it's not sufficient. But I know I'm taking a lot of time. I had a lot of opinions about this. When I first came into this was very complicated to me and heavy to approach, because I just don't, it's a skilled profession that I don't practice in. But I believe I'm really grateful for all of the information that has been presented and the manner in which it's been presented. It was very accessible and easily digestible, even as intimidating as the breadth of it was at times. But it's been really helpful for me to appreciate that, our board and our state has done a really good job of, overseeing this profession. And I appreciate having the responsibility to follow in that tradition and to uphold that tradition. Ultimately, I just think that as we're talking about necessity, we can talk about we can incorporate in the comments from the committees. I think, again, I go back to the prop committee's, report. I think that's incredibly helpful and could be used almost verbatim in our explanation of why necessity continues to be important and relevant. I think discussion about the breadth of work that happens in an industry where there are, tens of thousands of licensees that we have to oversee, and that are doing work, in the accounting profession, they're going to, I can imagine, be presented with a lot of different circumstances and situations where that kind of mentorship and oversight from their colleagues and their superiors is going to be really helpful for those people who want to present as being experts in attestation. In order for them to gain that level of expertise necessary, I think this is an environment in which it's achievable for them. And all of this just again to say, I support necessity, and that's some of the background and rationale behind why I support the continued necessity of this attestation requirement.
Well, I would just say to some of your comments, this is a stakeholder group of different perspectives, and so thank you for bringing your non-accounted perspective to it. And that's why you are here, and so we appreciate all of our stakeholders here. Additional comments? Mr. Sentini?
Chair Salazar, I would just pick on one more word, and it's, I think, the most important one, necessary. And it just seems to me that it's obvious that it's not necessary, but it serves a very good purpose. And I think everyone would agree it serves some useful purposes. But is it necessary? Obviously, no.
Thank you for that. I will admit I did have to get my dictionary out and research some definitions of necessity when I was doing this. I'm going to jump in with a comment. As I'm incorporating all of this, I have some delayed reactions to the QC report from Mr. Williams. And we've talked about it. There was support for the 500 hours, and I understand the value that role adds. As a board member, I love the work being done by the committee and how it adds value to our process. But I put on my hat, and I think back to when I was an initial licensee, and it was a while ago, and the rules were a little different back then. You had to wait a little longer. But I do remember, to the comment of people who have submitted, the example of, people have submitted the role of the QC is to dig into some of the details, if maybe there's not enough planning, but maybe they have enough hours, and to really kick the tires. And I think to where I was, and I go, it was tied, completing my licensure was tied with standing in the firm, promotions, and compensation. And my desire to get that, although, I felt I met the requirements and they were adequately distributed in the various categories of audit, I never tied that minimum threshold for licensure with the expectation that I was qualified to sign off on an attest engagement. So I guess as just a member, I would, of this committee, I would share that experience and caution us from valuing, from maybe some of our non-CPAs, from a sort of connecting those two. Just because people want to achieve their license, that's great. I mean, all candidates want to get there and complete that. But it doesn't equate with necessarily their preparedness to sign. And so if we tie those two together, that may be walking us down a path of necessity that I just am not sure that I think is logical. And I don't know if any of our other CPAs have reactions to that, because I do think, that might be relevant. Ms. Hines?
Yes, so are you all suggesting that you could have the requirement with, like, if you answer the necessity question as no, you can continue to require the attestation experience requirement? Because from the way that I'm reading from the way that I'm reading the regulations and all the materials that are being presented to me, if you don't need an attestation requirement, then our committee's done with our work. And we don't ever have to get to that discussion about sufficiency or anything like that, because the attestation requirement is not necessary. No, I mean, I get that's what you're saying, but back to Chair Salazar, if you say it's not necessary, then we're finished.
No, and I'm not saying we're not. I'm saying in light of consumer protection, I would caution us from drawing a correlation necessarily between that minimum threshold and if it's not necessary, does that mean we're endangering the public? I mean, there's this, what are the ramifications? And I guess I would just throw out, as a candidate, I can only speak to my own experience. I was very anxious to complete my licensure requirements, but that didn't correlate with risk to the public because I was not putting myself in a place to actually sign. And so that was just a comment. I wasn't saying sufficiency or anything.
I'm sorry, I know my colleague has one statement. I just want to make sure to a point, I'm not making that correlation. I am
saying you are.
No, but I just want to make sure, I want to put on the record, because you're not the only person that's listening, and other people will be viewing this and listening when we come back to the full board. And I want to state, I am not making the correlation that necessity then is a element of attesting to the qualification. I am seeing there are two separate questions that are presented to us legally. Is it necessary? And if it is necessary, then is it sufficient? And in my mind, if it's not necessary, then we don't have to talk about the quality of it or anything like that. It's not necessary. So that's just because of the example that you presented. To me, that doesn't apply to what the way that I'm thinking about it. I just want to make that clear.
Much appreciated. I was not trying to imply that, so I appreciate the clarification for the record. And Ms. Lopez.
Yes, thank you, Chair Salazar. The way I frame the question in my mind to help myself, gather this huge topic, because again, I am not a CPA, and yeah, these are very important questions, is the necessity question that we are facing. I attribute that in my head to mean, is California going to continue to have a bifurcated license where it's an A and a G license? Or if California no longer does that, and relies on just one license. There are examples of other states that have mechanisms in place to make it, to make it work, where CPAs are licensed under one license. As far as the question, consumers in California perhaps aren't very privy to the difference between the two licenses. CPAs, however, should be. And if a consumer is going to somebody with a G license and asking them to perform audit work, that CPA should absolutely say, well, wait a minute, let me refer you to somebody else. I'm not qualified for that. So whether the consumer is aware of either of the two licenses, I'm not so worried about that question. So that's all to say, in my mind, bringing it down to the fact, should California continue to have two licenses, I believe, is the way to look at this necessity question. Because whether the work is going to be needed in California, of course it's going to be needed in California. Whether we have two licenses or one. Right now we're talking about maintaining that structure of two licenses or changing it to one.
Thank you. And I hear that, and my question or my belief is that even if there was a single license and a consumer came to a CPA, whether or not there's an A or a G actually doesn't impact their professional obligation to respond, whether or not they are qualified. So we're not talking about the authorization to perform it. They have to respond on their qualifications. So if we have a single license, in your example, the ethical responsibility of the accountant actually is unchanged. If you are not an expert, not only in audit, in the niche field of that audit client area potentially, then you should be referring that to someone who is qualified. So I'm not, from my chair, I'm still not seeing how it is necessary to distinguish when the professional standards have that same requirement to everyone. So I come back to a question that I struggled with early on, which is why are California's requirements to protect the public different and higher than elsewhere? And the things I hear different things from the same materials. I hear, we've got peer review oversight, which is functioning really well. Not all states have functioning proc committees, which I thought was interesting. We have experience requirements for the UAA and professional standards team. You're supposed to get experience in the area you wish to practice in. So there's some safeguards built in there. We have a very successful enforcement practice. We've determined that our practices are substantially equivalent in other states. And I take that and I flip it over and say, well, other states that don't have the two-tier have achieved the same outcomes. So, and we have all of those professional standards already referenced into our guidelines through statutes and regulations that were in one of our great handouts that kind of talked about due care and competence. So, I hear the same materials and they speak to me and say maybe it isn't a requirement, because I'm struggling with why California needs it. What makes us different, Mr. Santini? So I'll throw that question out. Help me. I'm trying to, process it.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what you just described, because I was going to comment, as the information that was shared earlier around the professional the responsibilities, I think, address some of those issues with regard to what a CPA can do. And, when you talk about the general public not understanding the distinction between A and G, most of my partners in the CPA firm didn't understand that distinction. I candidly didn't understand it until I became more active in the profession. And the only time it came up was when they were asked to sign off on certification requirements and things like that, because many of the partners and people with experience when they became a CPA didn't have this distinction. But the point I wanted to make, I think the professional standards address a lot of the concerns. So yes, we have a different requirement, but I don't know if it's a higher requirement, because candidly, I think it's somewhat hollow. I don't think the 500 hours is improving or increasing or creating something that doesn't already exist. And therefore, I don't think it's necessary. Do I think experience is necessary? Absolutely. Would I assign somebody on an engagement that didn't have past experience without proper level of supervision? No, we wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. But experience is necessary. But this 500-hour requirement creates this false pretense that, without it, we're going to have people performing work above their pay grade or something like that. And I just don't know. I'm trying to figure out what scenario we're concerned about that would create that situation. Somebody reaches the 500 hours, makes it through Michael's committee, becomes a CPA, opens up the storefront, and then begins to perform audits. Is that kind of, I guess that would be the scenario, which would lend itself to the question of what are we doing to address firm licensing, not an individual. I think that, that's why I have trouble separating the question about necessity at an individual level versus what we may need to do at a broader level, but I'll put that aside because I know we're not at that discussion point. But I just don't know if it's really, again, I described it somewhat of a hollow type of barrier, I guess.
So, and you mentioned firm licensing, which is something other states do. Ms. Hines mentioned that, I think put it in her parking lot to come back to it. And so I think what you're saying resonates with me. We're only speaking about necessity for individual licensure, not concluding that there might not be other, I believe Mr. Dustin calls them belts and suspenders. Is that the right analogy? I'm not an attorney, so that might not be part of a conversation. I guess since I'm not seeing hands, and correct me, hands, Nancy.
I was waiting to.
There you go.
That's a good point.
Thank you for saving me.
Peer review is an after the fact, when the damage is done, finding something, recognizing there's an issue. And enforcement is also an after the fact, when something has become an issue. California's position thus far, unless we decide otherwise, has been to kind of be more preventative instead of reacting after the fact with peer review and enforcement. I think, I don't know, Mr. Dustin, I think you mentioned, I don't know if I'm going to state it properly, but many peer review findings are not necessarily related to inaccurate financial statements. They can be systems issues and that kind of thing. At least some of the cases that come before this board have to do with financial statements that are issued grossly lacking the application of professional standards and behavior of CPAs in other than a professional manner. Now, do I have statistics to measure the percentage of those to the total? No, I don't. I don't know that Mr. Franzella does either. But a lot of that is after the fact, and the surveys even brought into question those responding, and I realized we only had about 3,300 responding, and there was a mixture of brand new people to people like me that have been doing this for a while. And an indication that it's important to maintain that experience requirement, and an indication that those initial hours, whether it's 500, whatever it is, did give them the ability, to go out and perform a test work. Ideally, a person completes that minimum, and perhaps it's more. You can work in a very large firm and you can audit one area for a very long time and not really be able to have those questions all answered positively, affirmatively, that the person demonstrated and understood, the standards and the work that they were doing. But I at least felt when I took that was an achievement. Okay, I can now go out with minimal supervision and I can complete an audit. Now, if I were doing it myself, that would be a smaller audit. I grant you that. It would not be, it wouldn't be General Motors or anything like that. But I did look at it, contrary to what Ms. Salazar mentioned. I did look at that a certain way. And at that time, there were not G's and A's. There were just CPAs, and that's what we all did. and maybe I'm just an old timer and that's what I'm used to, but I still felt that it gave me that and that it's necessary and more of a preventative than an after the fact reaction. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Ms. Hines.
So I guess we do have to get pretty granular into what we're talking about. And so, because I'm making some assumptions that we're all on the same page, and clearly we're not. Acknowledging that we're not talking about the ability of a licensee to perform attestation services. We're talking about the ability of a licensee to sign attestations, to put their name down and say, like, this is a properly performed attestation and it meets a certain standard of quality of care. So just putting out there that, even as a layperson, I recognize that there's a difference that we're talking about. So we're talking about not whether someone can work on an attestation with only 500 hours experience or in a firm, but whether or not someone can put their name down saying, this is good, this is qualified, this meets certain standards. So we are saying, like, whether or not it's necessary for there to be these requirements for someone to be able to sign an attestation and then assert and put out there, and for a consumer to be able to trust that it meets a certain standard of quality. Ultimately, what we're talking about, here is whether or not, as a board, we trust that licensees will appropriately moderate themselves or regulate themselves to not engage in work that they're not qualified to do, or that they don't have the expertise to do, and that they won't put themselves out there to consumers professing to have an expertise that they don't actually possess. Now, I will go back to my experience as a lawyer, and I will say that we have a bar exam and we have coursework and continuing education and licensing and all of that. And the number of lawyers that go out there in the world and say they can do things that they cannot do, I mean, innumerable. Any lawyer, once they pass the bar, can hang a shingle and say, I can defend you in a capital murder case, never having, worked on a capital murder case before. And the defendant who hires them has no idea that they need to have certain kinds of experiences and expertise. To me, this attestation, because it's such a specialized area, is kind of similar to that, where we in California say, it's not just enough for us to say that accountants can use their best judgment, and we trust that accountants, will use their judgment, and not put themselves out and sign that they have the ability to do something, because our experience in the past has shown us that they don't. So we're going to have this additional requirement. It's necessary for us to have this additional requirement. And so we came up with this requirement that in order for you to sign an attestation, you have to have a certain amount of experience, and implicit in that is the experience has to be of a certain quality. So the question we're presented with today, does that continue to be necessary? And I would say I've heard a lot of information and argument that it continues to be necessary, assuming that when it was originally determined that it was necessary, it was valid and accurate. So then I would say, if it's not necessary, why is it not necessary? Is it not necessary because other states don't have it? Again, as an arrogant Californian, that's not relevant to me. Just going out front. But then also, I think that the nature of our practice area is such that it is larger than other places. It's probably more diverse than a lot of other places. And so that, warrants some differentiation from other places, which is much more credible than my arrogance, But I would say, why isn't it necessary anymore? Why should we remove this as a requirement? What has changed from before that predicated us coming up with this requirement as a necessity? And, and then we get to, and what would we do going forward? And that would be where the staff would come in. So why isn't it necessary anymore? Why is it no longer necessary after 20 years of us, having this requirement in order to sign attestations?
We have a taker for that, Mr. Dustin.
I'll dip my toe in the water. And I'll go back to something that Ms. Corrigan said when she referenced the fact that there have been cases where people have been significantly lacking in the quality of the work they do. And the fact is, those are people that hold A licenses. So then I look at, having an A license doesn't guarantee that somebody who is authorized, if I put quotes around authorized, is actually qualified. And I think what you've heard from some other folks is the fact that what helps to assure quality are things that exist in professional standards that everybody has to abide by, whether you're in California or any other jurisdiction. And I think that's ultimately what happens. And I'm sure the legal profession and all other professions have those professional standards by which professionals have to practice. And so I go back to, is it necessary? And I struggle with that, because while I could meet that requirement, which authorizes me to sign a report after, and again, I hate to say 500 hours because I know it's not cast in stone 500, but that doesn't mean 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, when I have an A license, that I'm going to do quality work. It's a point in time. It's a measurement. It doesn't reflect on how I'm going to be in the future. And all the other professional standards address that.
So, engaging a little bit in this, back and forth, because that's how we're going to get to being able to support whatever decision we make. Again, we're not talking about whether or not at 500 hours you could sign an attestation. We're talking about whether or not, once you have gone through a process of applying for a license to be recognized as someone who can sign attestations, representing that you've met the minimum number of hours and the quality of the work, whether or not it's necessary to continue to have that differentiation. Whether it's necessary to say that in order for you to put yourself out there as someone who is qualified to sign an attestation, you have to apply for this recognition. You have to apply for this. And the process by which you apply for it, that's the sufficiency part. But do we continue to need to have a separate identification application process for you to sign an attestation? From Ms. Corrigan's examples, and I think you did touch on it, a lot of those examples were people who really were not qualified. And I would actually then possibly say that they're outliers. They're people who I won't attribute malintent to them. I'll say they misunderstood or misinterpreted their expertise, and then they went out there and they did something that they really couldn't do. And to me, that says, yeah, because you know what? If you want to sign an attestation, you shouldn't have an A license. You should go through the process of getting the attestation license, if I'm looking at this right, but of having that recognition, of having that expertise, and then you wouldn't run into the problem of coming before the board having signed this statement that you knew what you were doing when you actually didn't know what you were doing. So we're saying that if we're saying today it's no longer necessary for there to be this attestation experience requirement, then won't we run into more circumstances where there are people who are saying that they, in their own judgment, they're good at signing these attestations because in their own personal judgment, they met the standards? I mean, don't we run that risk? And then if we do run that risk, then what are we going to do to address it? And I'm just not sure that as a board, I would be comfortable with saying like, yeah, let's take that chance. Let's eliminate this requirement and let's let the, licensees decide when they should sign and when they shouldn't. So, I mean, I think you say like, define why it's not necessary, explain why it's not necessary, and then we can put that into whatever, decision that we make.
Corrigan.
Yes, and Mr. Dustin, you're correct on that point. Something that comes before enforcement, that is a financial statement that does not follow professional standards, likely been issued by a CPA, so they've already been licensed. So that's a good point, and I understand. In the case of peer review, and I suppose in the case of those financial statements as well, it could be a firm that does not have its policies and procedures in place, is not using current checklists. It could be staff doing the work. It could be the CPA supervising them, who's doing an inappropriate job of reviewing and accepting responsibility. I mean, just like a whole bag of situations that can occur. And yeah, historically, California has, I guess, tended, and I don't really like saying this way, but maybe not putting the trust on the licensee to say, I'm not really qualified to do the audit in this industry. Let me refer it to someone who is. I mean, we've tended maybe to not do that by loosening up this requirement. We've tended again to look at it in a more of a preventative, or let's put this standard in there and let's have them do this. I mean, it may be an indication that the 500 hours is insufficient. I mean, it could be that it needs to stay in place and the requirement needs to be higher. I mean, I don't know, and I can't wrestle with that one just yet either, because I need to think about it more. But I want to give you, you are correct on that point, but I think there are a lot of other situations that could involve staff of a firm, that are not licensees. So anyway, thank you.
Additional comments? Mr. Williams?
So this is my first meeting, and I've been on the QC. This is my second round, and throughout the time, I think we probably average about 20% of people don't pass or are deferred for reasons about not understanding the experience requirements or talking about the hours. But to me, the committee and then the work that the staff does before it comes to committee is a QC, right? A quality control type of thing. You're looking for hours and you're looking for these other things. And I think that, and then they, if they believe it needs to be reviewed by the QC, the committee, then we review it. I don't think it's undue burden, but I think it is a way of showing the public that we are watching out for them for attestation. So, to the point earlier about, why we should get rid of it. I mean, I think it works. I think it is a way. I think it is showing the public that we are looking out for them. So I'm a big fan of it. Now, again, I'm biased. I'm on a QC, and I've seen a lot of things over the years. But you'd be surprised to see the signers of the Form E talking about, this and that, and they should know better. So it is out there. It's not rare, but it's not common either. But I think we have about a 20% fail rate or deferral rate. So I think that tells you something. And since I've been on for a long time, I don't see that. I haven't seen that change. So thank you.
Okay. All right. So we do have, at this point, we have a committee member that has asked for a call for a vote. But I believe before we even go to a vote, we want to open it for public comment within headquarters here. So I would like to welcome any public comment from the audience members. Okay, come on up. We do have public comments. Please announce yourself.
Doug Aguilera, Chair of the Enforcement Advisory Committee, speaking as a CPA and qualified. I do think that in order to protect the consumer, that we should proactively make sure that our members who are potentially going to sign Attest engagements are qualified and have gone through an apprenticeship process. While they may not be planning on signing an Attest engagement today because of experience, they're going to be the signers in the future, and they're also going to be the ones who are going to be signing off on qualifications. So I like the proactive approach of protecting the consumer by having these experience requirements in place.
Thank you for that comment.
The
we have a second comment?
About the 500 hours. I do think it is hollow. The only purpose I can think of is if you were to have a practice where you were strictly doing, say, pension plans, and someone could sit at a table and get the get all the steps done within 250 hours. In my mind, that person would still be green and would need a little bit more seasoning. So there is some benefit in my mind to having a certain minimum number of hours, just a maturation process. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your license holder perspective there. And I would like to welcome additional public comment.
Jason Fox of the California Society of CPAs. So I wrestled whether I should make any comments here. And just to be clear, Cal CPA doesn't have a position per se on this, because clearly there's a lot of good arguments on both sides, but I just wanted to maybe add a couple notes that, I think the decision of whether the current requirement is necessary or not doesn't preclude this group or the board looking at other frameworks to kind of potentially address the questions on what parameters should be put into place as a level of entry. So, maybe these suspenders aren't the right suspenders, but that doesn't mean there aren't other suspenders out there, to borrow Mr. Dustin's comment. So, and I do think, particularly if the firm is the one that's essentially kind of putting themselves out there on this level of service to the consumer, there may be some conversation around potentially is that the onus where there should be some levels on the firm as opposed to the individual CPA. I don't know if that's the right solution or not, but again, I think it's kind of clear there's the current requirement needs a level of adjustment, and I do think maybe there's some things to look out beyond just the individual experience requirement for the first level of entry into the profession. So just food for thought.
Thank you for that public comment. And that concludes our public comment here at the Board of Accountancy. So at this point, I would like to invite our moderator to open up the online Q&A to invite public comment through the website.
And this is your moderator, and we've opened up the Q&A feature of WebEx to facilitate public comment. If you would like to make a comment, you can look for the question mark icon, typically in the lower right corner of your WebEx screen. Click that, type the word comment in the text box and click send. The other option is you may raise your hand to be recognized. You can do that by clicking on the hand icon on your WebEx screen, or call-in users may push *3 to raise their hands. Each person will be given 5 minutes to speak. And I see no requests for public comment at this time. Shall I close the public comment feature?
Yes, moderator, please close the public comment feature. And so we do have an ask to call for the vote. I would like to restate the motion and then affirm that I correctly captured the motion, because we have had some discussion. And so the motion, as I understand it on the floor, is the motion for this task force to recommend to the Board of Accountancy that I just lost the motion. That the initial experience requirement is necessary. Is that sufficient for you?
That's correct. Thank you. For licensure in California, yes. Thank you.
Correctly, just for licensure. And we've got a clarification since I lost the motion.
We're talking attest, not the way that's framed out. It's all the requirements as opposed to we're just talking about the attest experience requirements. So
Mr. Franzella, would you like to restate the motion?
I absolutely would not.
I have it written if you would like me
Yes, Nancy, Ms. Corrigan, if you would restate it, that would be fabulous.
I made a motion for the Cert task force to recommend to the California Board of Accountancy that the attest experience requirement is necessary for licensing CPAs in California.
Fantastic. And we have concurrence that is the motion that was seconded. So we do have a valid motion on the floor. We could probably discuss for hours, but we've decided to put a pin in that discussion. And so with that, I'm not seeing any arms waving from our task force members that have any last minute desperate comments. And I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Connor for the vote.
Katrina Salazar,
I'm going to say no.
Carrie Ann Farrell Hines, Nancy Corrigan,
Yes.
Dan Dustin,
No.
Liz Molina Lopez,
Yes.
David Sentini,
Yes.
Rich Siminian, Michael Williams,
Yes.
so yes, the motion passes.
Yeah. So I will say it a little louder for everyone who is online. The motion has passed, and the Cert task force is recommending to the Board of Accountancy that the attest experience requirements is necessary. There we go. So I believe with that, that was the big difficult item, but we do have a few more things on here. So as we move along to item 13, I would like to turn it back over to Mr. Franzella for the next agenda item.
I will pause.
Sorry.
President Salazar, do we have additional direction, though, that we have to give to staff after this motion?
Mr. Franzella.
No, not at this time. What we'll do coming out of this is we'll prepare a item for the board. Well, first, we'll prepare some talking points for you to provide to the board at the September meeting, but not for them to act on it, just to provide an overview and a recap of what discussed today. And then we will take a paper in November that will recap a lot of the discussions and then what the final recommendation was, and get the board's approval of that recommendation or input on that recommendation. And from there, we will kind of transition to the sufficiency part and see if there's anything from the board that they want to provide in advance for Cert's discussions around that topic, and kind of plot along from there.
And yes, if you would move along to 13, thank you.
So item 13 was, or is intended to be a discussion and possible action to approve proposed November meeting date for the Cert task force. However, I would recommend that at this point that be deferred in light of the fact that all the meeting dates are either before or the same day as the board meeting, and until such time as the board kind of affirms or provides better direction on the task force recommendation, there's not much this task force should really explore until the board has made that decision. And if the board approves the recommendation, they'll provide that direction, and we'll be reaching out to members shortly thereafter to identify a potential date. If they disagree, we'd be doing the same thing, reaching out to members to find a date. So I think at this point, it's just better to defer that topic or defer this item.
Questions from the committee members on this item? Does that planned course of action make sense to everyone? Fantastic. Okay. I suppose I need to open even this item to public comments. Those are public comments? Hearing no public comment, moderator, would you be willing to open the Q&A for public comment on this item?
Certainly. If anyone has any public comment for agenda item 13, you may look for the question mark icon in the text box, type the word comment, and click send. The other option is to raise your hand either by clicking on the hand icon in the WebEx screen or *3 for the call-in users. And I see no request for public comment. Shall I close that?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And then our final item on the agenda is items for future consideration of the Experience Requirements Task Force meeting. And I will just suggest that Mr. Franzella did outline path for us, that we will wait for Board of Accountancy action and additional directive prior to scheduling. Are there any additional items that our task force members would like to place on the agenda specifically in advance of the board directive? Seeing none, public comments? And seeing no public comments on agenda items for future consideration, I would ask for a moderator to please open up the Q&A for public comment.
And we've opened up the Q&A for public comment. If you have anything that you'd like have the committee consider for coverage in the next meeting, type the word comment in the text box or raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon. Call-in users can press *3 to raise their hand. And I see no requests for public comment. Shall I close the feature?
Yes, please close the feature.
Thank you.
So with that, I would like to thank all of our task force members for their engaging contributions, the staff, our chairs for their work in the presentations and pulling together the materials. I really appreciate this, and I'm looking forward to continuing the journey with you. With that, this meeting is adjourned. Be well. Thank you.